Interesting. So we're going to start where last week we started with the first chapter. We chose one Mishnah from the first chapter, and this week we're moving on to the second chapter because that's the chapter that's going to be studied this Shabbat afternoon. Again, we're going to choose just one Mishnah, and even within that Mishnah, we're only going to be looking at part of it because it's quite a long Mishnah and there's a lot of big ideas in it. So we're not going to be able to go through all of them. We're just going to look at the middle portion of the Mishnah. So let me pull up the paragraph for you so that you can read along with me. Okay, so this is actually the first Mishnah, and it was stated by Rabbi Judah Hanassi, known also as Judah the Prince. He was actually the one who codified the Mishnah altogether, and was very prominent and instrumental and influential in the time of the Mishnah. So we'll read the whole thing together, and then we will choose one portion to talk about. So Rabbi Judah Hanassi would say, which is the right path for man to choose for himself? That which is harmonious for the one who does it and harmonious for mankind. So when thinking about which path to take, which approach to take, how to orient yourself in your direction in life, the most correct path would be one that is obviously good for you, but also good for humanity and mankind as a whole. Okay, we need to be balancing our personal quest for growth and achievement with what we should be contributing and helping society and others with as well. That's the first section. Second section, and this is the one that we're going to be looking at in more detail. Be as careful with a minor mitzvah as with a major one, for you do not know the rewards of the mitzvot. Consider the cost of a mitzvah against its rewards, and the rewards of a transgression against its cost. Okay, so Havei Zahir b'mitzvah kala kavachamura. We should be exceedingly careful with a minor mitzvah, just as we would be with a major mitzvah. Okay, this is an interesting statement. There are some questions that come up, and we're going to talk about them. I'm just going to finish reading the Mishnah just for completion. Contemplate three things, and you will not come to the hands of transgression. Know what is above from you: a seeing eye, a listening ear, and all your deeds being inscribed in a book. So if we think about these 3 points, it will make us aware of the fact that our behaviors are being observed and heard and watched, and that will obviously make us act more carefully and be more mindful of the things that we do and say. So let's move back to the middle portion of the Mishnah. Okay, we are instructed to be careful with a minor mitzvah as much as we would be with a major mitzvah. Now, this is a little confusing because if we look at the Mishnah again, the Mishnah itself says there are minor mitzvahs and there are major mitzvahs. It's acknowledging that there is a difference between different types of commandments. But then it's going on to say, well, let's just disregard all of that and treat all of them equally. So are all mitzvahs equal, or are they not equal? Are there greater mitzvahs? Are there lesser mitzvahs? It's not really very clear what approach the Mishnah is taking. I want to expand this in general. Yes.
So I was just going to say that I think that the difference, what they're kind of bringing up, what they're saying is that the mitzvahs might be different in, intensity, but how we approach them should not be. So it's more about us than the mitzvahs.
Okay, that's a very interesting insight. And actually, one of the commentaries does say that in fulfilling the mitzvahs, we should be, what the Mishnah is trying to tell us is that we should be equally enthusiastic about fulfilling all the mitzvahs, because we don't know, is God rewarding us for the mitzvah itself that we're doing, or is he going to be rewarding us for the enthusiasm and the joy and the zeal with which we approach the mitzvah? And I think what you're saying relates to that and is very interesting, and will relate to some of the other points that we're going to bring up. But before we resolve it completely, let's just expand on the question and the discussion a little bit. In general, in life, there are things that are a big deal, and then there are details. So even if in a big project that we might be doing, or a big endeavor that we're pursuing, right? There's the overarching vision or objective that we're trying to accomplish, and then there's obviously going to be details in that as well. So when we think about approaching something important, do we generally tend to think that what deserves more focus are the big important things? Or do we tend to feel like, no, the details are much more important, let's focus on the details, even though they're smaller? What would be, I mean, if you were thinking about what your own approach should be, or if somebody came to ask you for advice, what would be your idea of how to approach this kind of thing?
Well, I mean, just personally speaking, sorry, I'm in a chatty mood, I guess. I
Girl.
I am, like I approach things, I'm very detail oriented. And so I would keep the big picture in sight, but to avoid from getting overwhelmed with that, I would really focus on the details. I'm a little more detail oriented.
Right. Okay, anybody have a different approach, or do you do the same?
We won't let there so much air go by. I probably agree with Luann. But I'm are we still weighing what is it? Are you giving a big mitzvah for a reason, or are we? I'm not exactly sure.
What do you mean giving a big mitzvah for a reason?
I meant as when we're speaking of Luann, replay what you just said, what you just emphasized.
So I guess my focus, whether it be a big mitzvah or a small mitzvah, I tend to be detail oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of, helps me to not get overwhelmed, even though I believe in the big picture. It helps if I kind of can break it down and focus on the small steps to get there.
Right.
And I'm all over the place. So I'm not exactly sure where I am half the time. But when we're talking about big, or are we still on big or little mitzvahs? Is that what is one better than the other?
What would we think is more deserves more investment or more priority or more focus?
It's how it's given.
Given by
Is it by, if we're doing a mitzvah, so if I'm doing a mitzvah, I am hoping that I give it in a way that is in a way that somebody doesn't have to know it's a mitzvah. Or this goes back to our last week when we were talking about, and I really enjoyed it, as a matter of fact, because it was really about having a soul and being very caring.
right. Okay, so you're talking about the approach to the mitzvah,
Yes.
and not necessarily what the specific mitzvah is. You're saying that that's important.
Yes.
Right. Okay. That's also definitely true. It's an interesting discussion. Obviously, there's different angles. I don't think anybody can say that details are not important. We've seen in many situations how very important details are. There's an anecdote about a company that was very successful and very popular and profitable, and suddenly began to decline quite rapidly. And all the main people in the company were getting together, trying to figure out what's going wrong, what's changed all of a sudden. They hired consultants and they were trying to analyze and figure out, and they thought they need a whole new marketing campaign. What's going on? Why has our popularity suddenly declined so much? Why are we not getting as much business? And after thinking through and analyzing and talking and discussing, they realized that the only thing that had changed in that span of time was that they had hired a new receptionist. And it came to light that this receptionist wasn't particularly kind and polite on the phone. And so when people called and they received an unfriendly, unwelcome greeting and reaction from her, they became less inclined to call again, and the business started to fail just because of that. So, I mean, in the big picture of a company and what they're trying to achieve, and the audience or the clients that they're trying to serve, there's many other great visions and goals and objectives that they have, which are far more important and deserve more focus than the person who's sitting at the front desk. But obviously, who's the person who's sitting at the front desk is also an important part of the company. And even though it's more of a detail, you can see how that kind of thing can really have a major impact.
First impressions are very important.
Right, exactly. Then that's if that's the face of it and that's what people see, then even if there's something wonderful and fantastic behind it, nobody gets a chance to go beyond that first step. There's a story of a man, a Jewish man, who was once put in jail. This happened many, many years ago, mid 1400s. And one day the king offered him a chance to be free for one day so that he can have a chance to practice his religion freely for one day. And trying to decide what to do, he wrote a letter to the great sage of the time. His name was Rabbi David ben Rabbi Shlomo ibn Zimra. And he said, which day should I choose? Should it be Rosh Hashanah so I can hear the shofar? Should I choose Passover so that I can have a Seder and eat matzah? And the sage told him, the first day that you can take to be released and practice your Judaism, that is the day that you should take. Don't make calculations, it's this holiday or that holiday. As soon as you're able to get out and have an opportunity to do the mitzvahs as you should, for that one day, that is the opportunity that you should take. So this story, what does it seem to indicate about approaches to doing a mitzvah and choosing one mitzvah over another mitzvah, or relating to a mitzvah as being more or less important than another? If we think of the advice that the sage gave to this particular unfortunate prisoner, don't make those calculations. Don't think about Passover or Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or any other day. As soon as the king is willing to release you for that one day, even if it's a regular weekday, take your chance, take your opportunity, and go ahead and fulfill the mitzvahs that you can on that day. What kind of attitude is that encouraging?
So I guess it means that even it's better to do even a minor mitzvah rather than wait immediately, rather than wait for a long time to do a really major one. So every mitzvah has a meaning to it.
Okay, beautifully. I think that's really beautifully said. Yes. As soon as we have that opportunity, we don't want to give it up and squander it and wait, even though we think maybe we'll be getting to something bigger and more important later. So yes, I think that's a very true point. So one of the commentaries, one of the main commentaries on the Mishnah, known as the Bartanura, he says that if you look in the Torah, if you look in the scripture doesn't talk about the rewards of specific, mostly you don't find what is the reward of a mitzvah in the scriptures. You do find consequences for transgressing a mitzvah, right? There are different categories of punishments for transgressing a negative mitzvah. So for example, what would be a negative mitzvah? Violating Shabbat, let's say, in specific ways. Okay, there are positive mitzvahs that we do. Eat matzah, for example, that's a positive commandment. The opposite of that, or not quite opposite, but the corresponding sort of negative commandment of that would be not to eat leavened bread on Passover. So we know that the Torah specifies what the punishment is for eating leavened bread on Passover, but the Torah doesn't tell us what the reward is going to be for eating matzah on Passover. And that's mostly, by and large, through the Torah. As you go through it, you'll see that for the negative, the prohibitions, the Torah will say, this is the punishment or that is the punishment. Whereas for the positive commandments, the Torah doesn't say what the reward is going to be. So let's talk about the negative commandments just for a moment. Okay, if we know that certain commandments, transgressing them leads to the death penalty, whereas other commandments, transgressing them leads to a fine, will that change how we feel about how important or severe a certain mitzvah is or isn't. Will that give us a feeling of, well, if this particular violation is the death penalty and this particular violation is a fine of money, then I'm going to stay away from the first one much faster than from the second one, right? There is some kind of order of priority over here. And especially as human beings, you know, as much as we dream of, I mean, I don't know how many of us dream of being perfect, but we would all like to be better and do better. But we know that it's very difficult to do everything exactly 100%. So if we're going to think about where we're putting our energies and where we're going to invest more and try more, then we're naturally more inclined to stay away from something that seems more severe, and not focus as much on something that seems to be much less of a big deal. And that's normal human behavior. The same is true for positive commandments, for positive mitzvahs. We may know that God wants us to do a certain number of things, but obviously each mitzvah takes effort, it takes investment, it can take sacrifice, it can take giving up something from ourselves. So we may not always feel up to doing everything all the time. So in that case, which mitzvah would we be focusing on? Would we be focusing on something that seems to be of lesser importance, or would we throw our energies into something that seems to be of greater importance?
So, based on kind of the Bible studies at my high school, what I remember in Israel, we were told that the mitzvahs between a person and their neighbor, their friend, are actually more important than preserving the mitzvahs between God and us. So it would be more important to respect our parents, for instance, rather than potentially eating strictly matzah on Passover. That is how I kind of perceive it, if based on kind of what we learned.
Right. Okay, I mean, there's so what you're saying is that whatever the framework is for you to choose what you think is more important or less important, there would still be certain mitzvahs that you would say, okay, I'm going to focus. If I can't focus on everything because I'm not up to that right now, I'm going to focus on this more than the other one because it is more important, because I was taught that it's more important, or because I read about it and I see how important it is. Let's talk, let's bring an example of a situation where, you know, there's these extenuating circumstances, shall we put it. So, for example, let's take the fast day of Yom Kippur, okay? So we all know that Yom Kippur is a day that is a day of atonement and forgiveness, and one of the main way that we mark it is by fasting, and of course there's prayer and introspection and a lot of other things. But let's say there's an individual who usually would fast on Yom Kippur but is feeling very sick, and to not just a minor headache, but to a very extreme degree, and feels like they really need hydration. They're gonna faint, they're gonna black out. So obviously we know that in Torah and in Judaism, preserving life is paramount. And you know, we wouldn't ask somebody to fast on Yom Kippur at the cost of their life. However, does that mean that the person should immediately go ahead and say, okay, I'm just going to eat and enjoy a meal as much as I need to in order to regain my strength? Or is there a procedure? Are there priorities? So in this case, with fasting, for example, if you look at the different laws, drinking is considered a lesser violation than eating of the fasting. So the person would first try to drink just to rehydrate and refresh themselves and get themselves back together by drinking. Obviously, if that is not enough and it's not going to bring them back enough, then they can then move on to eating as well. But the point of the example that I'm bringing is that there are layers, there are parameters, there are in cases where of extreme difficulty, there are certain things that are deemed lesser transgressions or greater transgressions. So the concept or the rationale of prioritizing and saying this mitzvah seems to be more important than that mitzvah, it does exist, right? There is room for it. There is place for it. There are levels in keeping different mitzvot, right? So how, therefore, are we to understand this Mishnah, which is telling us you need to be careful with the small mitzvahs just as much as you are careful with the big mitzvahs, when clearly, as the Mishnah itself testifies, there are smaller mitzvahs, there are greater mitzvahs. What is it teaching us? What approach is it trying to give us? So, on a simple level, if we look at the positive commandments versus the negative commandments, the Mishnah is talking about the positive commandments. Whereas with the negative commandments, as I mentioned just before, we have some indication. We know that certain transgressions result in a greater punishment and other transgressions in a much lesser punishment or no punishment at all, other than the punishment of having sinned. With the positive mitzvahs, we don't know the reward. And since we don't know the reward, we have no barometer. We have no way to measure. Is this commandment, is charity greater than Shabbat candles? Is sitting in the sukkah greater than being kind to an individual? We don't know, because the Torah doesn't give us any indication of what the reward can be. And if we don't know what the reward is, we don't know that mitzvah A has a greater reward than mitzvah B, then we don't know that mitzvah A is greater than mitzvah B. So the Mishnah is talking about the positive commandments. And since we don't know the rewards of the positive commandments, we don't know which is greater and which is lesser. So therefore, we shouldn't be deciding this one is more important, that one is more important, but we should be investing as much as we can equally in all the different mitzvahs. But we still haven't fully resolved our problem, because the Mishnah still uses those words, kala kavachamura, lighter mitzvahs and more severe mitzvahs, or bigger mitzvahs and smaller mitzvahs. The Mishnah still has those distinctions in it. So are we really truly able to go beyond the distinctions and just feel that each mitzvah is equally important regardless of how great or small they might seem? So we're going to look into some Kabbalah now to get more of an inside view of a mitzvah, and that will help us understand in more depth and with greater appreciation whether mitzvahs are different, whether they are the same, if we can categorize and distinguish between them, or if we should be giving each of them equal fair play. So we're going to start with a concept that's very well known in Kabbalah of Or and Keli. Or, which literally means light or energy, spiritual energy, and Keli literally means a vessel or a container or a receptacle through which the energy can find expression. Every mitzvah has these two components to it. It has the energy within it, the spiritual energy, and it has what it is expressing through its receptacle. And let me give you an example to make that more concrete. Let's think about electricity. Okay, electricity is an energy, and raw electricity is all the same. It's one kind of energy. But if you look around the room that you're in, or your home, you'll notice very quickly, if you look at the different lightings that you have, that some of the light that you have is very bright and strong, and some of your lamps are much dimmer and softer. Do they have different energies in them? Is there a different type of electricity that goes into the stronger lamp than the electricity that goes into the weaker lamp? The raw electricity is the same, but the vehicle through which it's being expressed is different. Some light bulbs have the capacity to produce a very strong, bright light. Other bulbs have very low wattage, cannot produce very strong light. And in fact, if you try and flood them with too much electrical energy, then they will burst. So when we think about a mitzvah has these two components to it. It has the spiritual energy, which can be said to be the same, but I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a moment. And then you have the expression of the energy that's coming through it, which is different for each and every single mitzvah. Let's take what we're doing right now. Okay, right now we're studying together. Okay, studying Torah is a mitzvah. We are studying a Mishnah. This Mishnah has been in existence for thousands of years, and it exists for all time, right? Even when nobody's learning this Mishnah, it still exists. It's an energy that exists. Once we study it and we're plugged into it, so the Mishnah is finding expression. It's finding an outlet, and it's becoming more concrete. Interestingly, however, each of us, we're all learning, studying together. We're all hearing the ideas of the Mishnah, but we all have different perspectives. We're all coming from different viewpoints. Some parts will resonate with some people, some parts will resonate with other people. Based on our life experience or our previous study, we may take the ideas in this Mishnah and relate it to different subjects. You know, one of us will relate it to one area and another one of us will relate it to another area. So whereas the spiritual energy inside is one thing, the expressions that it goes through can be varied and very different. So this can be seen on the one hand to possibly be diminishing the power of the Mishnah, because it's becoming limited to one specific viewpoint or another specific viewpoint. But on the other hand, before we plugged into the study and the energy of the Mishnah had no meaning, had no relevance. It wasn't being manifest or expressed in any way. So wonderful, in theory and spirituality existed, and it had some spiritual life, but it hadn't come down into any sort of practical benefit or effect just yet. Any questions so far on this concept? So let's look at a mitzvah. A mitzvah has these two components to it. A mitzvah has the energy, the spiritual or the light, and it also has the expression of that light. So let's go back to the mitzvah of eating matzah. Okay? If we think about it, there's a lot of specifications to the mitzvah, right? It's supposed to have certain ingredients. There's a time frame within which the matzah is supposed to be baked. There's a certain time that it's supposed to be eaten. Okay, there's certain parameters that need to be met in order for it to be considered the mitzvah of matzah. So I'm going to turn the question around a little bit. If there are so many specifics and parameters, can we say then that a mitzvah is energy, or is a mitzvah only an expression of energy? What do you think?
I think it takes a lot of energy to do a mitzvah.
It definitely takes a lot of energy to do a mitzvah. And there's reason for that too, and there's explanation for that as well. But you're 100% right. It takes a lot from us.
And energy, I think it's very interesting that it's like very energy is needed everywhere. For the mitzvah, to make the matzah, so that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. You're saying all along the process, from the right at the very beginning through the end of the fulfillment of the mitzvah. Yeah.
I actually think that, yes, so a mitzvah is definitely the way that we express the energy that's in us. However, I feel that when we do a mitzvah and we do it wholeheartedly, not expecting anything in return, that energy is actually being replenished. So we're kind of getting back that light, that energy, and that kind of gives us the ability to give even more to those that need us.
Wow, you are very bright.
Thank you.
Very bright.
That's a really beautiful idea.
How old are you?
I'm 41.
That's a really beautiful idea, Julia. And we're going to talk about that more in just a moment, actually.
That's a great way to put it. Very philosophically.
I'll tell my kids, they'll be happy that I came up with a good idea.
Carry on.
It says that the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. This is in a later chapter. That there's something that's accomplished by doing the mitzvah, and we're going to talk about it in a moment, which is reward enough. There's not another additional reward that we're looking for, like you say. We're just doing it for the sake of the mitzvah on its own. So the truth is that when we fulfill the mitzvah according to the specifications that God has set out, in whichever area it is, whether it's Shabbat, whether it's charity, whether it's taking responsibility for our environment, there's endless mitzvahs. We all know that. So yes, we are tapping into a specific, we are tapping into something specific because of the specific parameters that mitzvah has, but then that does give us access to a much deeper and higher level of energy, of spiritual energy, which is common to all the mitzvot. Because while each individual mitzvah does have its specific accomplishment and its specific impact that God wants it to have, as a whole, all the mitzvot share something in common, which is that they are all God's will. They are all Ratzon Hashem. That's something that is equal in any mitzvah that we are doing. And the word mitzvah is related to, in Aramaic, tzavta v'chibur. It means connection. When we do a mitzvah, when we fulfill a commandment, we do a good deed, we are connecting to God in a concrete way. It's not just a feeling that I have in my heart. I care about Judaism. Judaism is important to me. You can feel all those things and think all those things, but to prove that it really matters to you is to actually act on it and do something about it. Because then it's not something theoretical and abstract, but it becomes actualized and it becomes real. So going back to treat big mitzvahs and small mitzvahs alike, if I have an opportunity right now to do a mitzvah, it's a small mitzvah, it's not a big deal, to smile at the person who just walked past me, or to say thank you to the individual behind the counter who just provided me with a service. I'm saying that I'm making a statement that my Judaism is important to me and important enough that I'm going to act on it. If I think to myself, oh, this mitzvah is so small, it's unimportant, so therefore I'm just going to dismiss it to the side, then I'm saying maybe Judaism is important to me sometimes, it's not important enough. If we think about the analogy of spouses, of a husband and a wife, okay, a husband says to his wife, oh, I love you so much. She says, oh, that's so sweet. Would you take the garbage out for me? He says, take out the garbage? No, what does taking out the garbage have to do with it? I don't want to take out the garbage. I love you. I'll be there for you in the hardest times. I'm not taking out the garbage.
Were you at the dinner table with me tonight? Because there was a lot of garbage and I didn't want to take it out.
Don't give away my powers.
That's what she needs.
What did you say?
That's what she needs.
Right, exactly. If that's what you need right now from your husband, then his showing you love will be that right now he's going to take out the garbage, even if it's, you know, what's garbage? Garbage is not important in the big scheme of life, right? You know, there's other more important visions that you have for yourselves and for your family, more than making sure the garbage is taken out every day. But if that's what you need right now, and your spouse is showing that they don't care or it's not important to them, you don't think to yourself, oh, they just don't care about the garbage. You think to yourself, they don't care about me. They don't care about the relationship. They don't care about the connection, right? So when we have an opportunity, God has given us an opportunity to do a good deed, and we think, I'm not interested right now, or, you know, for Yom Kippur, I'll be there. I'll make sure that I don't miss Yom Kippur. Okay, that's great. That's very nice. But the heart of the relationship is missing. And the depth of the love and the connection is not being expressed properly. There's a story of a rabbi who was very involved in outreach, I believe in Israel. And he would connect with young adults who didn't know very much about Judaism and were interested in being educated and learning more. And he would try to teach them what he could and give them some nice Jewish experiences. And unfortunately, tragically, very tragically, one day this rabbi lost a child of his. I'm not sure what the cause was. Of course, terrible, tragic event, very, very sad. And he was sitting shiva after the passing of his son. And a group of these young adults, I think there were about 10 of them, came to visit him to do the mitzvah of comforting a mourner. And as they were as they were sitting there and they were feeling, that they really wanted to do something for this rabbi who taught them so much and connected with them in such a great way, they turned to the rabbi and they said, in memory of your son, we would like to commit that the next Shabbat, we'd like to keep the whole Shabbat completely, fully, entirely. Okay, so this was a group of young adults who were not observant of Shabbat on a regular basis, but felt that as a merit for the soul of the child and a gesture to this rabbi, they wanted to do this, something as a special merit. And the rabbi was very genuinely touched and felt encouraged and happy when he heard what they had decided to do. Now, sitting with the rabbi was a friend of his, another rabbi, who was never really very understanding of the kind of outreach work that his friend was doing, engaging with people who don't always consider Judaism to be so important, who don't have much education in about Torah. He never really understood this whole thing. And he heard the exchange, he saw the exchange, he didn't say anything. Anyway, a couple months later, the two rabbis, they were talking to each other, and somehow this conversation came up about what had happened, those months back at the Shiva house, how this group of boys had taken on to observe one Shabbos in its entirety, and the rabbi who had a relationship with them was talking about how they had followed through and it was so special and so wonderful. And his friend said to him, maybe I shouldn't say this, but really, I mean, how meaningful is it? Most of the time they're not keeping Shabbat. Most of the time they're not observing all the things they're supposed to, throughout the 25-hour period. So is it really meaningful that for one Shabbat that, they're not going to use their phones and they're going to have a Shabbat dinner and they're going to go to the synagogue and pray? I mean, it's one and gone and done. So maybe the rabbi turned, the outreach rabbi, shall we call him, turned to his friend and he said, what I wouldn't give to have one Shabbat to spend with my son.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're looking at mitzvahs and we're looking at what's more important and what's less important, and are we being consistent? Are we not being consistent? We can have an overarching view and look at the whole big picture and feel like, we're not doing this well enough, or that is too much out of our reach, or, and all these kinds of feelings. Does it really matter what I'm doing? Does it matter when I do this? Does it matter when I do that? But Judaism and Torah and mitzvot, they're not a mathematical calculation. There's a certain formula, and if you follow it, then you're great. And if you don't follow it, then you don't get the right sum at the end. This is a relationship. This is a connection with God. Let's take one mitzvah at a time. Let's take one opportunity at a time. Right now, I have a chance to show God that I care about my connection with him, and that I want to strengthen that connection with him by doing this mitzvah or by paying attention to this small detail. So let me focus on that. Let me do that. And let me think about how much that means to God. And of course, being God, God sees and he knows. He knows if we're giving something up. In order to do that mitzvah. He knows if right now maybe we're going through a very hard time, and usually it would be easy for me to do this mitzvah. But right now I'm so drained that it's really challenging, and I'm nevertheless going to still do it, or at least do part of it when I feel like I can't do any of it. God sees all of these things. He knows where we're up to, he knows where we're coming from, and he knows which direction we're headed in. And whereas in a regular human relationship, spouses don't always understand or perceive the motives and the feelings underneath the actions, God does know exactly what's going on. And that gives so much value to every effort and every overture that we make. So when we look at this Mishnah and we see that it tells us, be careful with the small mitzvahs as you are with the large mitzvahs, it's encouraging that kind of perspective. As I mentioned last time, the whole focus of the Pirkei Avot, of the section of the ethics of our fathers, it's not talking about the bare minimum of Jewish law that we're supposed to be fulfilling. It's talking about bringing out more depth in the way that we're doing, in the way that we're fulfilling the laws, and in the way that we are approaching our Judaism. So as we see in this Mishnah, instead of thinking of it as checking the boxes, did I do enough that God's not going to punish me? Did I do enough that God's not going to be angry at me? That's not what it's about. It's not whether I made sure to avoid the big transgressions and okay, the small transgressions are not so bad. It's about a relationship. It's about a connection. It's about the meaning in the mitzvah and the bond that it's bringing us between us and God. And I think that when we think about mitzvot in that kind of way, it gives it a whole different depth and dimension, and it changes the way we approach it in general, which could then hopefully also make certain things a little easier for us when we recognize the power and we recognize the meaning. So that's what we have to think about from this week's chapter of the Ethics of Our Fathers. I hope it's given you some food for thought and perhaps another perspective that you may not have considered. I'm going to end the